Hello class, this is Case Study 1 Part 2, in which we will further explore sediment losses and gains, focusing on an investigation of the human impacts. Now that we know more about the ecology of the San Francisco Bay, let's start to focus on the human impacts of the bay, which is really going to help us get down to the mystery of these sediment deposits. Over the last 15,000 years, climate change has shaped the bay and North America as a whole, as the glaciers receded and ice melted. Now, as these glaciers receded, it filled certain areas of the bay in with different types of mud, rock, and also water. Now, several thousand years ago, earthquakes moved certain areas of the California coast up and others down. And now today, we have a nicely filled in San Francisco Bay estuary. So climate change has historically formed the bay, and we know now from current climate change research that bay waters are rising. And so this starts to make us think about the future and perhaps even environmental justice issues. Who lives in areas around the bay that are going to be more prone to flooding? So did climate change contribute to sedimentation in the bay? Well, historically, not significantly, and in the future, probably not. But climate change has shaped the bay historically and will continue to influence the bay. Especially this is true with wetlands and the plants and animals and other organisms that live in these wetlands. Wetlands absorb not only pollutants, but also the abundance of water that comes into the bay. Wetlands therefore act as a buffer and a sponge at the same time, and they play a key role to maintaining balance in an estuary. However, some wetland plants do not respond well to the changing conditions brought about by climate change. So now we're going to look at a few different organisms that are ultimately being affected by human activities. And the first is we're going to look again at these native oysters. So these oysters are animals that live in the bottom of the bay, and they are usually filter feeders. And their populations have been dramatically declining over the last 100 years. Now these oysters are often considered a keystone species. And a keystone species is defined as a species whose presence and role within an ecosystem has a disproportionate effect on other organisms within the system. Now, because these oysters are able to filter out huge volumes of water, they end up filtering out a lot of different contaminants. They also tend to pile up on top of each other, forming what we could consider a reef of oysters that can become an important habitat. If enough oysters can reestablish themselves in the bay, that will ultimately start to lead to cleaner bay waters. This will also start to eliminate some of that sediment that we see in the water, which could help out some types of fish and other native species recover. But remember, these native oysters sometimes get outcompeted by invasive types of organisms that come into the bay in the bilge water of ships. So did oyster decline contribute to sedimentation in the bay? Well, it might have, because with fewer oysters, we have fewer filter feeders. When the population thrived, they probably reduced sedimentation 100 years ago with their filter feeding. Another human activity that has affected the bay is damming. Humans build dams in rivers, typically in the mountains, so that they can collect water that can be piped to where humans need to drink and bathe and get their freshwater sources. Damming traps sediment, and less sediment may have been a good thing back in the day, but now, with recent decline in sediment, removing dams might bring helpful sediment levels into the bay to actually build up wetlands as water levels in the bay rise. So we have this system that is the San Francisco Bay estuary, and the sediment is changing. We have this mud, but sometimes the mud gets washed out, and it's all about maintaining balance as a part of the San Francisco Bay Delta watershed. The name of the dam is the O'Shaughnessy Dam at the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, which was finished in the Sierra Nevada mountain range in 1923. This dam provides water and electricity to the 2.4 million people of San Francisco, San Mateo, and Alameda counties. Also, we can generate power as water flows through this dam, and this power can be used to give us the energy we need in our lives. So, did damming contribute to sedimentation in the bay? Well, the answer is no historically. It might have actually decreased sediment, since now we were stopping sediment from coming down the rivers and ending up in the bay. But now we are holding back this sediment as we have these dams in place. So again, it's all about balance. I'm not saying that we need to remove all of the dams, because we need our fresh water. But sometimes some of these dams might be out of date. If we have too much mud, that turns wetlands into mudflats. But if we have too little mud, that inhibits wetlands from continually restoring themselves in the face of erosion. Now, these San Francisco wetlands in the San Francisco Bay were destroyed when all this mud came in. And remember, that's really the basis for this case study. The overall effect of mud on the San Francisco Bay ecosystem. Now, a wetland is an area of land whose soil is saturated with moisture, either permanently or seasonally. Such areas may also be covered partially or completely by shallow pools of water. Different types of wetlands includes swamps, marshes, and bogs, among others. The water found in a wetland can be saltwater systems, freshwater systems, or brackish. And brackish means that it's a mix of both salty and fresh water. Now, these wetlands provide very important ecosystem services, including flood control, groundwater replenishment, shore stability, and water purification. So another human activity that has also affected the bay is called hydraulic mining. So we've discussed the unique bay ecosystem and some critical activities that have shaped the bay, including oyster decline, climate change, and dams, specifically the O'Shaughnessy Dam at Hetch Hetchy. Now the big one. Let's talk about hydraulic mining and its impact on the San Francisco Bay. Well, first off, what is hydraulic mining? Well, it is a technique that was used during the gold rush, essentially using water blasters to uncover gold from the rocks up in the mountains. Now, before we further explore how hydraulic mining is connected to the San Francisco Bay, we need to define the term watershed. The San Francisco Bay is part of the largest watershed on the west coast of the United States. In fact, this watershed drains almost half of California, and it drains it by connected waterways into the San Francisco Bay. That is to say, San Francisco Bay receives waters from all of the rivers that are found throughout almost half of California. The big takeaway message here is, once again, everything is connected. Even though actions are not local to where we are, we can still be impacted by them. So when this gold rush was occurring 160 years ago, and all of this hydraulic mining was occurring, where did it happen? It happened along major waterways. And as they're blasting all of this dirt and mud to try to find the gold, it all drained through the watershed and ended up in the San Francisco Bay. If you haven't figured it out already, sure enough, the gold rush shaped the San Francisco Bay shoreline. And this really brings into context the themes of environmental systems and environmental unity, the fact that everything is connected in these systems. This also touches on the tension between global and local. Mining was not done local to the San Francisco Bay, but the San Francisco Bay was heavily impacted by these factors happening tens or hundreds of miles away. So let's talk again about this mud. Remember why it matters in the first place. Too much mud in the bay means we have a decreased depth, we have a habitat destruction and loss, and we have a loss of species. And all of these are ultimately going to result in problems for the balance of this ecosystem. And it's largely caused by humans and our activities. Also remember that the San Francisco Bay has a very complex food web. When one trophic level in our food web is disturbed, this disturbance can trickle down to the entire food web. And sure enough, all of this mud that came into the bay from hydraulic mining affected food webs greatly. So, does that mean we should stop the sediment? Well, not necessarily. Much research has shown that normal sediment flow is an important part of maintaining a healthy ecosystem. For example, sediment flow aids in the creation of wetlands, and wetlands provide much needed buffering against rising water levels. So again, there are no easy answers here, and in environmental science, there are rarely easy answers. It's all about looking at all of the factors and seeing how they are connected so that we can make the best choices as we are faced with rising sea levels and global warming. Now, as a final word, I want to mention that mud wasn't all that was brought down during the gold rush. And we're going to explore other things that were contained in that mud in our Part 3 lecture. All right, that's it for today. Please email me with any questions, and thank you very much for listening.